It wasn't a scream that silenced the room. It was a murmur. 100 of the city's most ruthless power brokers, their wives wrapped in silk, their bodyguards squeezed into tailored wool, all frozen by 6 words. "Get away from her!" He didn't shout. He didn't reach for the weapon resting beneath his jacket. He just stood there, a shadow bleeding into the chandelier light. And in that sudden, suffocating silence, the only sound left was the terrified, ragged breathing of the man who had dared to touch her. The ice sculpture was melting. It was supposed to be a swan carved from a single block of winter, but the sheer body heat of 300 corrupted souls packed into the Hawthorne estate was turning it back into a puddle. Faye watched a bead of water gather at the tip of the swan's beak, swell, and drop onto the velvet tablecloth. She preferred the dying swan to the rest of the room. The annual Hawthorne Charity Gala was a masterclass in aggressive philanthropy. The city's elite gathered to bid on abstract art and antique watches, pretending the money was going to underprivileged youth rather than greasing the palms of local politicians. Faye wasn't here to bid. She was here because her boss at the gallery told her it was mandatory. The gallery laundered money. Everyone knew it. Nobody said it. It was the kind of open secret that kept you breathing as long as you kept your mouth shut. Faye took a sip of her champagne. It was warm and tasted like copper. "You're avoiding me, Faye." The voice slid over her shoulder, greasy and familiar. She didn't flinch. She just tightened her grip on the stem of her glass until her knuckles turned white. Preston Croft. He stepped up beside her, crowding her space. Preston was a middle-tier earner for the syndicate, a man who moved numbers around on offshore servers and thought it made him a god. He smelled heavily of aged scotch and expensive cloying cologne, the kind of scent meant to mask the smell of desperation. "I'm working, Preston," she said, her voice flat, keeping her eyes fixed on the melting swan. "I'm assessing the pieces for the auction. The auction doesn't start for an hour." Preston leaned closer. His shoulder brushed against hers. The fabric of his tuxedo was rough against her bare skin. "And you haven't returned my calls about the provenance documents for the Caravaggio sketch, because it's a fake," Faye said quietly. She finally turned to look at him. His face was flushed, a faint sheen of sweat gathering at his hairline despite the heavy air conditioning. "It's a very good fake, Preston, but it's a fake. The pigmentation in the underdrawing uses a synthetic binder that wasn't invented until 1940. I'm not signing my name to the appraisal." Preston's smile didn't reach his eyes. His eyes were dead, frantic things. "You don't understand how this works, do you, sweetheart? The boss needs that sketch validated. The buyer is lined up. A very wealthy, very impatient man in Geneva. If that sketch isn't real, I look bad. If I sign the appraisal and the buyer has his own experts look at it, the gallery goes under," Faye countered. "And I go to prison for fraud, or worse." "You're not going anywhere." Preston shifted, blocking her path to the crowded ballroom. The string quartet in the corner was playing a soulless rendition of Vivaldi. Waiters in white gloves drifted through the crowd carrying trays of sweating oysters and caviar. No one was looking at them. In a room full of predators, a smaller predator cornering a mouse was just nature taking its course. "Excuse me," Faye said, stepping to the left. Preston stepped with her. "I'm not asking you, Faye. I'm telling you. You're going to go back to the office on Monday, and you're going to print out the certificate of authenticity, and you are going to stamp it." "No." It was a simple word, a short, sharp exhalation of breath. But to a man like Preston, a man entirely reliant on the illusion of his own authority. It was a physical blow. His face darkened. The veneer of the slick, high society broker vanished, leaving the ugly, violent thug beneath. He reached out, his hand snapping around her upper arm. His fingers dug into her flesh, biting down to the bone. Faye gasped, the sound swallowed by the swell of the violins and the dull roar of 100 conversations. She tried to pull away, but his grip was like a vice. "You listen to me, you arrogant little bitch," Preston hissed, his spit hitting her cheek. He leaned his weight into her, pushing her backward against the edge of the buffet table. The ice sculpture rattled. "You work for us. You belong to us. You do what you're told, when you're told, or I will make sure you end up at the bottom of the harbor with the rest of the garbage. Do you understand me?" Faye's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. The pain in her arm was blinding, sharp, and radiating up to her shoulder. She looked around. A woman in a diamond necklace made eye contact with her, then quickly looked away, taking a sip of her martini. A state senator standing 10 feet away turned his back. They saw. They all saw. And not a single one of them cared. Panic, cold and sharp, began to flood her veins. She was entirely alone. She opened her mouth, ready to scream, ready to break the social contract of this twisted society and cause a scene that would likely get her killed. But at least she would go down fighting. She never got the chance. The shift in the room didn't happen all at once. It started near the grand mahogany double doors at the entrance of the ballroom. It was like a drop of ink hitting a glass of clear water. The noise began to die out in a rapid, spreading wave. The clinking of glasses ceased. The low murmur of political bribes and illicit deals fell silent. Even the string quartet, sensing the sudden vacuum of sound, faltered, the cellist dragging his bow across the strings in an ugly, discordant squeak before stopping entirely. Preston didn't notice at first. He was too focused on the fear he was trying to carve into Faye's face. He was leaning his heavy frame into hers, his fingers bruising her arm, his breathing loud and jagged. Faye noticed. She looked past Preston's shoulder. The crowd was parting. They weren't just stepping aside. They were retreating, pulling their bodies back as if making way for a controlled explosion. The sea of silk gowns and dark suits split perfectly down the middle, creating a wide, empty aisle that led directly to where she was pinned against the table. Walking down that aisle was Vincent Russo. He didn't swagger. He didn't puff out his chest. He moved with the quiet, devastating efficiency of a landslide. He was dressed in a tailored charcoal suit that looked less like a fashion statement and more like armor. His dark hair was brushed back, threading with early silver at the temples. His face was a mask of carved granite, tired, utterly devoid of warmth, and terrifyingly calm. 2 men trailed a few paces behind him, massive figures with dead eyes, but no one was looking at them. Every eye in the room, all 100 guests, was fixed on Vincent. He stopped 5 feet from the buffet table. Preston finally felt the silence. The absence of noise was suddenly deafening. He turned his head, his grip still tight on Faye's arm. When Preston saw who was standing there, the blood completely drained from his face. His skin turned the color of wet ash. Vincent looked at Preston. He didn't look at the hand on Faye's arm. He didn't look at Faye. He looked directly into Preston's eyes with a gaze so hollow and unyielding it felt like staring into an open grave. "Get away from her," Vincent said quietly. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't inflect it with anger. He spoke the words as a simple, irrefutable fact of the universe. Gravity pulls things down. Fire burns. Preston Croft gets away from her. The silence in the room was absolute. 100 people barely breathing. A woman near the front of the crowd had her hand clamped over her mouth. The state senator was staring at the floor. Preston's mouth opened, closed, and opened again. He looked like a fish suffocating on a dock. "Mr. Russo," he stammered, his voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched wheeze. We were just having a disagreement about an appraisal, a business matter." Vincent didn't move. He didn't blink. He just let the silence stretch, heavy and suffocating, wrapping around Preston's neck like a wire. "I said," Vincent repeated, his voice dropping a fraction of an octave, vibrating in the marrow of everyone's bones. "Get away from her." Preston dropped Faye's arm as if her skin had suddenly turned to molten iron. He stumbled backward, his heel catching on the thick Persian rug, nearly sending him sprawling. He caught himself, his hands raised in a gesture of frantic surrender. "I'm sorry," Preston gasped, backing away. "I didn't know. I swear to God, boss, I didn't know she was—" He trailed off, swallowing hard. "I apologize. It's done." Vincent didn't acknowledge the apology. He didn't look at Preston again. The man had ceased to exist in his reality. Vincent finally turned his gaze to Faye. Faye stood frozen against the table. Her arm throbbed violently where Preston had gripped her. Her breath was coming in short, shallow gasps. She looked up at Vincent, her cynical mind racing, trying to process the magnitude of what had just happened. Vincent Russo, the head of the most brutal organized crime syndicate on the eastern seaboard, a man who rarely left his fortified compound, had just walked into a crowded room and publicly claimed her. He stepped forward, closing the distance between them. Up close, she could see the exhaustion etched into the lines around his eyes. She could smell him. Clean soap, sharp espresso, and something inherently metallic. He didn't ask if she was okay. He didn't offer a platitude. He looked down at the rapidly darkening bruises forming in the shape of fingerprints on her pale skin. A muscle feathered in his jaw. It was the only sign of emotion he showed. He held out his hand. It wasn't a request. Faye looked at his hand. Long, calloused fingers. A heavy gold signet ring on his pinky. If she took it, she was saved from Preston. If she took it, she was damning herself to something far deeper, far darker, and infinitely more dangerous. But looking at the 100 faces staring at her, faces that had been perfectly willing to let her be assaulted 5 minutes ago, she realized she didn't have a choice. The cage had just changed owners. She placed her trembling hand in his. His grip was firm, warm, and absolute. He turned and began to walk back down the aisle of silent guests, pulling her gently but unstoppably in his wake. No one spoke. No one moved. The sea of elites kept their heads bowed, refusing to meet Vincent's eyes as he led her out of the grand double doors, leaving the melting swan and the terrified, ruined man behind. The night air hit Faye like a physical blow. It was crisp and damp, smelling of crushed pine needles and impending rain, a sharp contrast to the suffocating perfume of the ballroom. Vincent didn't slow his pace. He led her down the sweeping stone steps of the Hawthorne estate, his hand still enveloping hers. The gravel driveway crunched loudly under their feet. A line of black, armored SUVs sat idling in the circular drive, their headlights cutting through the darkness. As they approached, a man in a dark suit stepped out of the shadows and opened the rear door of the lead vehicle. Vincent guided her inside, then slid in beside her. The door slammed shut, cutting off the sounds of the night, sealing them in a tomb of quiet leather and tinted glass. The SUV began to move immediately, the tires spitting gravel before hitting the smooth asphalt of the private road. Faye sat pressed against the far door. The adrenaline was beginning to recede, leaving behind a cold, shaking dread. She rubbed her arm. The bruises throbbed in time with her heartbeat. Vincent sat completely still in the opposite seat. The passing streetlights flickered across his face, throwing sharp shadows over his cheekbones. He was looking straight ahead. "You didn't have to do that," Faye said. Her voice sounded loud in the confined space. It wasn't steady, but it wasn't broken either. She was determined not to sound broken. Vincent slowly turned his head to look at her. "He was breaking your arm, Faye." "I could have handled it." "How?" Vincent's tone wasn't mocking. It was genuinely curious, an academic inquiry. "Were you going to strike him? A man twice your weight, in a room full of people who depend on his illicit income? Or were you going to jump off the terrace and hope the rose bushes broke your fall?" Faye swallowed the lump in her throat. He had noticed her glancing at the terrace doors. He noticed everything. "I would have figured something out. I've survived in that gallery for 3 years. Surviving is not living," Vincent said quietly. He shifted his weight, turning slightly toward her. "And you wouldn't have figured it out. Preston is an animal. He's cornered. His accounts are bleeding, and he needed a win. You were going to be his win." "And what am I now?" Faye snapped, the anger finally burning through the fear. She leaned forward. "What am I now, Vincent? You just walked into a room with 100 of the most connected, ruthless gossips in the state and pulled me out of there. You didn't just save me. You put a brand on me." "I protected what is mine," he said simply. The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. "I don't belong to you," Faye said, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "I work for the gallery. I restore art. I don't move your money. I don't run your drugs. And I certainly do not belong to you." Vincent didn't argue. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small, folded linen handkerchief. He held it out to her. "Your lip is bleeding," he said. Faye hesitated, then reached up, touching the corner of her mouth. She must have bitten it when Preston grabbed her. She snatched the handkerchief from his hand and pressed it to her lip. It smelled faintly of his espresso and soap. "You're right," Vincent continued, his voice smoothing out into a low, even hum. "You restore art. You fix broken things. But you've been working in a viper's nest for 3 years, Faye. Did you really think I didn't know you were there?" Faye stared at him over the white linen. "What are you talking about?" "The gallery is a front. It's my front, which means every employee in that building is technically on my payroll." Vincent leaned back against the leather seat, his dark eyes locking onto hers. 3 years ago, you walked in, desperate for a job, carrying a portfolio of restorations that were too good for a back alley shop. I reviewed your file." "You reviewed my file," Faye repeated, feeling a sudden chill. I review everyone who handles my assets, Vincent said. But you were different. You were smart. You were cynical. You saw exactly what was happening around you, the laundering, the forged provenance, and you kept your head down. You did your job. You didn't ask for a cut, and you didn't run to the police. I needed the money, Faye said defensively. My brother's medical bills. I know about your brother, Vincent interrupted softly. I know about the bills. I know you paid them off 6 months ago, yet you stayed at the gallery. Faye looked away, watching the blurred lights of the highway. She had stayed because the money was too good, because normal jobs didn't pay enough to build the safety net she swore she would never live without again. She had stayed because the danger had felt distant, abstract. Until tonight. Preston has been skimming from the offshore accounts, Vincent said, changing the subject with whiplash speed. He's been trying to cover the holes by forcing the gallery to sell high-end forgeries. The Caravaggio sketch was his desperate play. Faye looked back at him. You knew? I knew, Vincent confirmed. I let him run with it to see who he would implicate, who he would try to drag down with him. I was waiting to see who he would threaten. You used me as bait, Faye breathed out, the realization twisting in her gut. You let him corner me. No. The word was sharp, slicing through the air like a blade. The calm mask cracked for a fraction of a second, revealing a flash of absolute, terrifying violence beneath. Vincent leaned forward, the space between them vanishing. I let him steal from me. I let him lie to me. But the second he put his hands on you, his life was forfeit. Faye's breath hitched. She was pressed against the door, but she couldn't look away from his eyes. There was a raw, undeniable truth burning in them. Why? She whispered. Why do you care what happens to me? Vincent looked at her for a long time. The streetlights washed over his face in rhythmic flashes. He reached out slowly. Faye tensed, but she didn't pull away. He didn't touch her face. Instead, his fingers brushed against the fabric of her dress, just below the bruising on her arm. His touch was impossibly gentle, a ghost of pressure. Because in a world full of liars, thieves, and butchers, Vincent said softly, you are the only real thing I have looked at in 3 years, and I am entirely done pretending I can watch you from afar. The SUV banked hard, taking the exit that led away from the city, away from the gallery, and into the deep, heavily guarded woods where Vincent Russo built his life. Faye looked out the window. The city lights were fading behind them. She had escaped Preston Croft. But as the iron gates of Vincent's compound rose up in the distance, she realized the terrifying truth. She hadn't escaped at all. She had just been caught by a much larger, much darker predator. And the most terrifying part wasn't the cage itself. It was the sudden, treasonous flutter in her chest that wondered what it would be like to let him keep her. The gates weren't wrought iron laced with romantic, ivy-choked family crests. They were solid, utilitarian steel, rolling back on industrial tracks with the heavy, grinding hum of hydraulics. Faye watched through the tinted glass as the SUV rolled onto the property. The compound was not a sprawling, Gothic manor. It was a brutalist fortress of poured concrete, dark timber, and reinforced glass, designed by an architect who clearly prioritized bullet trajectories over aesthetic charm. It sat heavy and low against the tree line, a modern bunker masquerading as a high-end estate. Security was not hidden. It was an explicit feature of the landscape. Men in dark, weatherproof jackets stood at intervals along the perimeter. A pair of Belgian Malinois paced the edge of the manicured lawn, their breath pluming in the damp night air. No one looked at the cars. They looked outward, their attention fixed on the dark woods beyond the floodlights. The SUV stopped under a massive concrete portico. The driver cut the engine. The silence that followed was dense, broken only by the rhythmic ping of cooling metal. Vincent didn't wait for a door to be opened for him. He pushed his door open and stepped out into the night, buttoning his jacket with a single, fluid motion. He didn't look back to see if she was following. He expected it. Faye sat for 3 seconds. 3 seconds to breathe in the recycled leather air of the car and acknowledge that the life she knew 2 hours ago was dead. Then she opened her door and stepped out into the cold. The damp air bit into her bare shoulders. She shivered, crossing her arms over the ruined silk of her gala dress. Vincent was already halfway to the heavy oak front door. He paused, turning slightly. He didn't say anything, but the subtle shift in his posture was an undeniable command to catch up. Inside, the house was a temperature-controlled vacuum. It smelled of ozone, expensive cedar, and nothing else. The foyer was vast, floored with dark slate. There were no photographs, no umbrellas leaning in a stand, no mail tossed on a console table. It looked like a very expensive hotel lobby the day before it opened to the public. A man was waiting in the hall. He was older, perhaps in his late 50s, with a neatly trimmed gray beard and a face lined with decades of stress. He wore a simple gray suit and held an electronic tablet. "Boss," the man said. His voice was a gravelly baritone. He glanced at Faye, his eyes catching the bruising on her arm for a microsecond before snapping back to Vincent. "Perimeter is locked. The Geneva buyer is calling every 20 minutes, and the situation at the Hawthorne estate is being managed." "Tell Geneva to wait," Vincent said, slipping off his suit jacket and handing it to the older man. "If he calls again, block the number until morning. And Thomas?" "Yes, sir. Get a doctor here in the morning." "I don't need a doctor," Faye interrupted. Her voice bounced off the slate walls, sounding sharper and louder than she intended. Both men looked at her. Thomas's expression remained perfectly neutral, a professional blank slate. Vincent, however, just stared at her with that same hollow, heavy exhaustion. "Your arm is swelling," Vincent said. It wasn't a debate, it was an observation of physics. "And your lip is still bleeding. Thomas will show you to a room. There are clean clothes in the closet. The bathroom is stocked." "And then what?" Faye asked, digging her heels into the slate floor. "I just go to sleep? I wake up tomorrow and pretend I'm your house guest? I have an apartment, Vincent. I have a cat. I have a life. You have an apartment that Preston Crofts Associates know the address to," Vincent corrected, his voice dropping to that low hum that vibrated in her teeth. "You have a life that currently intersects with a very messy, very violent internal audit of my organization. You will stay here until the audit is complete." "Am I a prisoner?" "If you were a prisoner, Faye, you wouldn't be standing in the foyer asking me questions," Vincent said. "You would be in the basement. You are here because I can guarantee you will wake up tomorrow morning. That is the only thing that matters tonight." He didn't wait for her to argue. He turned and walked down a long hallway, his footsteps completely silent on the thick runners, disappearing into the shadows of the house. Faye stood alone with Thomas. The older man tapped a command into his tablet, the screen briefly illuminating his weathered face. "If you'll follow me, miss," Thomas said politely. Faye didn't move. "Did he kill him?" Thomas stopped. He didn't turn around. He just stood with his back to her, perfectly still. "Mr. Croft violated several core tenets of his employment," Thomas said, his tone as flat and factual as a recorded automated message. "His contract has been terminated. This way, please." Faye felt the blood leave her extremities. Terminated. The euphemism was heavier than the truth. She swallowed the nausea rising in her throat, tightened her grip on her own forearms, and followed Thomas up the stairs. The room she was given was large, sparse, and immaculate. The bed was a massive island of white linen. The windows were floor to ceiling, but they didn't open. The glass was an inch thick. She walked into the adjoining bathroom and turned on the harsh vanity lights. She stared at herself in the mirror. Her mascara had smudged, leaving dark hollows under her eyes. The bruise on her arm was blooming into a vicious, mottled purple in the shape of 4 large fingers and a thumb. Her bottom lip was split and swollen. She looked like a victim. She hated it. Faye stripped off the expensive borrowed dress and let it pool on the marble floor. She found a heavy black cotton t-shirt in the closet. It smelled faintly of standard-issue laundry detergent, not of Vincent, and pulled it over her head. It swallowed her frame, hitting midway down her thighs. She lay down on top of the covers of the massive bed. She didn't turn off the lights. She lay awake for hours, listening to the heavy silence of the house, waiting for a scream that never came, realizing that true violence didn't announce itself with noise. True violence was perfectly, terrifyingly quiet. Morning didn't break over the compound. It seeped in. A heavy, gray, overcast sky filtered weak light through the bulletproof glass. Faye woke up with a sharp ache radiating from her shoulder down to her elbow. She sat up, her mind instantly sharp. She didn't have the luxury of disorientation. She was in a Mafia boss's house, wearing an oversized t-shirt, and she needed a very clear set of rules if she was going to survive the day. She found the bathroom stocked with unopened, generic toothbrushes and clinical-grade face wash. After scrubbing the remnants of yesterday's makeup off her face, she padded out of the bedroom. The house was active, but hushed. Men in dark clothes moved purposefully through the lower halls. None of them looked at her. They operated with the synchronized discipline of a military unit. Faye followed the smell of roasted coffee to a massive industrial kitchen. Thomas was standing at the counter, methodically slicing a grapefruit. "Good morning," Thomas said, not looking up. "Coffee is in the carafe. The doctor will be here in 20 minutes. "Where is he?" Faye asked, pouring a heavy ceramic mug full of black coffee. "Mr. Russo is in his office." "Where is that?" Thomas finally stopped slicing. He looked at her, his gray eyes assessing. "Down the main hall, last door on the left. I wouldn't recommend—" Faye didn't wait for the recommendation. She took her mug and walked down the hall. The door to the office was solid wood, slightly ajar. She pushed it open without knocking. Vincent was sitting behind a massive slab of a desk. He wasn't wearing the armor of his tailored suit today. He wore a plain, dark gray Henley, the sleeves pushed up to his forearms. For the first time, she saw the ink. Faded, intricate tattoos crawled up his left arm, disappearing under the sleeve. He was leaning over a series of open leather-bound ledgers, a pair of reading glasses perched on the bridge of his nose. He didn't look like a monster. He looked like an overworked accountant pulling a double shift. He didn't look up, but his hand stopped moving over the page. "You didn't knock." "I don't work for you," Faye said, stepping fully into the room. Vincent slowly took off his reading glasses and set them on the ledger. He looked up. His eyes dragged over her bare legs, the oversized black t-shirt, and finally settled on her face. A muscle flickered in his jaw, tight and controlled. "Technically," Vincent said, leaning back in his chair, "you do. The gallery is mine. Your paychecks clear through a shell corporation that I own. I restore 17th century oils, Vincent. I don't launder money. I want to know exactly what terminated means regarding Preston Croft." Vincent stared at her. The silence stretched. The only sound was the heavy ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner. He didn't blink. He was weighing her, measuring her tolerance for the reality she had just plunged into. "Preston was a liability," Vincent said quietly. "He stole from the organization. He forged documents, and he made a public spectacle of laying his hands on an asset I value. He is currently at the bottom of the Delaware River, anchored by 90 pounds of scrap iron. He delivered the information without malice, without pride. It was a weather report." Faye's stomach dropped. The coffee in her hand suddenly felt incredibly heavy. She had known, logically, what this world was, but hearing the sheer, logistical brutality of it spoken aloud in a quiet, sunlit office was entirely different. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She tightened her grip on the mug and forced herself to hold his gaze. "So he's dead," Faye said, her voice remarkably steady. "And the Geneva buyer? The man waiting for the Caravaggio?" A flicker of genuine surprise, and perhaps a ghost of respect, crossed Vincent's face. He had expected hysteria. She gave him pragmatism. "The buyer is a Swiss banker who uses art to hide his cartel money," Vincent said. He stood up, walking around the edge of the desk. He was taller than she remembered, his physical presence dominating the large room. "He wired $5 million to an escrow account based on Preston's promise of the Caravaggio sketch. If I tell him the sketch is fake, he pulls his money and he tells his cartel associates that my syndicate is pushing forged goods. I look weak. Weakness in my line of work is terminal." Vincent walked to a large leather sofa on the far side of the room. Lying flat on the cushions, wrapped in a protective, acid-free sleeve, was the sketch. "You brought it here," Faye said, stepping closer. "I had my men clear out the gallery's vault at 3 a.m., Vincent confirmed. "The gallery is closed indefinitely for structural renovations, which leaves us with a problem. The sketch is a fake." Faye looked down at the drawing. It was a masterclass in deception. The sepia ink, the hatched shading, the slight yellowing of the paper. It looked identical to a late Renaissance study. "It's a brilliant fake," Faye murmured, her professional instincts temporarily overriding her fear. She leaned over it. "The artist sourced period-accurate paper. They aged it using a mild acid wash. The stroke work is phenomenal, mimicking Caravaggio's aggressive, left-handed cross-hatching." "But it's fake," Vincent prompted. "Yes," Faye said, pointing with her free hand. "The ink. It's iron gall ink, which is correct for the period. But it hasn't corroded the paper. Real iron gall ink from the 1600s contains sulfuric acid. Over 400 years, it burns through the cellulose. This paper is completely intact. It was drawn less than 5 years ago." Vincent watched her. He wasn't looking at the sketch. He was watching the way her eyes moved, the way her hands hovered over the paper without touching it, the sudden, commanding shift in her posture. "Can you fix it?" he asked. Faye looked at him like he was an idiot. "Fix it? I can't build a time machine and age the ink 400 years, Vincent." "I don't need it to be real," Vincent said smoothly. "I need it to pass a secondary inspection by the Swiss buyer's appraiser tomorrow afternoon. I need you to make the ink look like it's burning through the paper." Faye froze. "You want me to forge the forgery?" "I want you to save your own life," Vincent corrected, stepping into her space. He was close enough now that she could feel the heat radiating off him. "If the deal falls through, the cartel will look for someone to blame. Preston is gone. The paper trail leads to the gallery. It leads to you, Faye. You were the lead restorer. They will think you were in on the scam." Faye looked down at the sketch, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She was trapped. Preston had chained her to the tracks, and Vincent was offering her a wrench to dismantle the train before it hit her. "I need a controlled environment," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "I need sulfuric acid, a micropipette, a neutralizing wash, and a localized UV heat lamp. I have to artificially accelerate the corrosion without eating a hole straight through the vellum. Thomas will get you whatever you need." Vincent reached out. Faye instinctively flinched, pulling her bruised arm back. Vincent stopped. His hand hovered in the air between them. The cold, mechanical mob boss fractured for a second. A flash of something violent and protective surging in his dark eyes as he looked at the purple handprint on her skin. He slowly lowered his hand, gripping the edge of the leather sofa instead. "The doctor is waiting," he said, his voice tight. "Get your arm looked at. Then you go to work." By mid-afternoon, the guest bedroom had been transformed into a makeshift laboratory. Thomas had procured everything on her list with terrifying speed. Thick plastic sheeting covered the mahogany desk. A high-powered, articulated magnifying lamp clamped to the edge, casting a harsh, clinical circle of light over the Caravaggio fake. Faye sat on a stool, her hair tied back in a messy knot, wearing a pair of thin nitrile gloves. The air in the room was sharp with the acrid smell of chemicals. She was in the zone. It was the only place she felt safe. When she looked through the magnifying glass, the world shrank down to microscopic fibers of cellulose and the precise application of corrosive agents. There were no cartels. There were no dead men at the bottom of the river. There was only the chemistry of deception. She held a micropipette, a tool usually reserved for genetic sequencing, loaded with a highly diluted solution of sulfuric acid. She hovered it over a dense cluster of cross-hatching in the drawing. Her hand was perfectly steady. Her bruised left arm rested on the table, a dull, throbbing anchor. She squeezed a fraction of a drop. The acid hit the paper. She counted to 3 in her head. 1, 2, 3. She immediately swabbed the area with a neutralizing alkaline base. She pulled back and looked through the glass. The ink had blurred slightly, the paper beneath it thinning, turning brittle and brown. It looked exactly like 4 centuries of slow chemical decay. She exhaled a long breath. 1 down, 200 to go. "Your hand doesn't shake." Faye jumped, her elbow knocking a small bottle of distilled water. It didn't spill, but her heart slammed into her throat. She spun around on the stool. Vincent was standing just inside the doorway. He had changed into a dark suit, sans tie, the collar of his shirt unbuttoned. He looked like a man preparing for a war council. He had been standing there, completely silent, watching her. "You need to stop sneaking up on me," Faye snapped, pulling down her surgical mask. "If I drop this pipette, I burn a hole through your $5 million problem, and we both end up on a cartel hit list." Vincent didn't apologize. He walked slowly into the room, crossing the floor until he was standing just outside the circle of the work lamp. He looked down at the drawing. "It's working," he observed. "Of course it's working," Faye said, stripping off her gloves and tossing them into a waste bin. "I know what I'm doing. It's tedious, but I can mimic the iron gall burn. The Swiss appraiser won't be looking for artificially accelerated decay. He'll just be looking for the decay itself to verify age." Vincent nodded slowly, his eyes shifting from the paper to her face. "The doctor said there are no fractures in your arm, just deep tissue contusions." "I'll live," Faye said dryly. She rubbed her shoulder. The painkillers the doctor gave her were making the edge of the world a little soft, but she fought to keep her mind sharp. "You didn't eat the lunch Thomas brought up," Vincent noted, gesturing to a tray sitting untouched on a side table. "I don't eat when I'm working on delicate pieces. A sugar spike makes the hands tremble." She looked at him, crossing her arms defensively. "Why are you here, Vincent? You have a syndicate to run. Don't you have knees to break or politicians to bribe?" It was a deliberate provocation. She was tired of the cold, mechanical facade. She wanted to see the man who had ripped her away from Preston. Vincent didn't take the bait. He didn't get angry. He stepped closer, entering the harsh circle of the lamplight. The shadows deepened in the hollows of his cheeks. "I do," he said quietly. "My men are currently sweeping Preston's apartments, tearing apart his hard drives to see how deep his rot goes. I have 3 lieutenants sitting in the dining room, waiting for my orders on how to restructure the money laundering operation now that the gallery is burned." "Then go give them orders," Faye challenged. "I will." Vincent reached out. This time, he didn't stop when she tensed. His large hand closed gently over her uninjured right shoulder. His thumb brushed against the collar of her oversized shirt. "But right now, I am standing here, verifying that the one thing in my life that isn't rotting from the inside out is still breathing." Faye's breath hitched. She stared up at him. The sheer gravity of his words anchored her to the stool. He wasn't using romantic, flowery language. He was speaking in the stark, cynical terms of a man who dealt exclusively in survival and betrayal. To him, she wasn't a muse. She was proof of life. "I'm not one of your assets," she whispered, though the fight had drained out of her voice. "I know," Vincent said. He stepped closer, his body heat wrapping around her in the chilly room. He looked down at the dark, ugly bruise on her left arm. "If you were an asset, I would have used you to flush Preston out weeks ago. I kept you out of it because you don't belong in the dirt, Faye." "Yet here I am," she countered, gesturing to the fake painting. "Forging documents to appease a cartel." "Here you are," Vincent agreed. He slowly dragged his thumb along the line of her collarbone. The touch was agonizingly gentle, a stark contrast to the violence he commanded. "Surviving, like you always do. When this is done, when the Swiss buyer takes the fake and the cartel is satisfied, you can leave. I will give you enough money to disappear, a new name, a new city. You will never have to look over your shoulder again." Faye looked into his eyes. They were pitch black, bottomless, and utterly sincere. He was offering her the ultimate exit, freedom, bankrolled by blood money. But as she looked at him, smelling the gunpowder and expensive soap embedded in his clothes, she felt a terrifying, cynical truth take root in her chest. She had lived her whole life playing by the rules, scraping by, terrified of the shadows, and it had gotten her assaulted in a ballroom while 100 good people watched and did nothing. Vincent was a monster. He admitted it. He lived it. But he was the only person who had ever stopped the world to ensure she was safe. "And what if I don't want to disappear?" she asked. The words hung in the chemically laden air. Vincent's hand froze on her shoulder. The steady, measured rhythm of his breathing stopped. For the first time since he walked into the ballroom the night before, the absolute control masking his face cracked, revealing a hungry, desperate ruin underneath. "Faye," he said, his voice a low, rough warning, "do not play games with me. You have no idea what it would mean to stay." "Then show me," she said, leaning slightly into his touch. The magnifying lamp buzzed quietly. The acid continued to eat away at the false history on the table. And in the center of a fortress built for war, Vincent Russo finally leaned down and closed the distance between them. The kiss was not a romance. It was a collision. Vincent didn't pull her into his arms with a sweeping, cinematic gesture. He simply closed his hands over her shoulders and kissed her the way a starving man takes bread. It was rough, tasting of dark espresso and the metallic tang of adrenaline. Faye didn't melt. She pushed back, grabbing the heavy cotton of his shirt, anchoring herself to the solid, unyielding wall of his chest. For 3 years, she had watched him from the periphery of her life. A terrifying phantom who owned the gallery, owned the city, and seemingly owned the air she breathed. Now he was just a man with a hammering heartbeat against her knuckles. He broke the kiss before she did. He pulled back a fraction of an inch, his breathing ragged, his forehead resting against hers. His eyes were squeezed shut, the lines of exhaustion around them etched deep into his skin. "If you stay," Vincent rasped, his voice vibrating through her chest. "There is no going back to the light, Faye. You become a target. You become mine. I do not share, and I do not let go." Faye looked up at him. Her lips stung where it was split. Her arm throbbed. She was standing in a room reeking of sulfuric acid, forging a masterpiece for a drug cartel. The light had burned out a long time ago. Before she could answer, a sharp, rhythmic knock rapped against the heavy wooden door. Vincent's head snapped up. The vulnerability vanished, instantly replaced by the cold, mechanized armor of a syndicate boss. He stepped back, putting 2 feet of distance between them. "Yes," Vincent barked. The door opened. Thomas stood in the hallway, his face an impassive mask, holding the electronic tablet. "The Swiss delegation is 20 minutes early, boss. They have cleared the outer gate. Mr. Keller is demanding to see the piece immediately." Vincent checked his watch, a heavy steel chronograph. "Put them in the secure conference room. No weapons. Scan them twice. Offer them water. Nothing else." Thomas nodded and disappeared down the hall. Vincent turned back to Faye. "Is it done?" Faye looked down at the Caravaggio. She had only applied the neutralizing base to half of the final acid burns. Panic, cold and sharp, spiked in her chest. "I need 3 minutes," she said, her voice dropping into a tight, professional clip. She spun back onto the stool, grabbing the neutralizing swab. "If I don't neutralize the remaining acid, the paper will literally disintegrate while Keller is looking at it." Vincent stepped back, giving her space. 3 minutes. Faye's hands flew over the vellum. The world shrank back down to a microscopic battlefield. She dabbed, blotted, and wiped. She couldn't rush the chemical process, but she could accelerate her physical movements. She neutralized the heavy cross-hatching near the subject's jawline, then moved to the shadowed drapery in the corner. 1 minute, Vincent said softly. He wasn't rushing her. He was pacing her. Faye applied the final dab of alkaline solution. She grabbed a soft, lint-free microfiber cloth and gently pressed it over the treated areas, absorbing the excess moisture. She pulled away and flipped on the localized UV heat lamp for exactly 10 seconds to flash dry the vellum. She turned off the lamp. She looked through the magnifying glass. The ink was perfectly, beautifully ruined. It looked 400 years old. "It's done," Faye said, exhaling a breath she felt she had been holding since last night. She carefully slid the sketch into a rigid, archival quality sleeve. Vincent walked over. He didn't look at the drawing. He looked at her. He reached out and gently tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear. It was a terrifyingly intimate gesture from a man preparing to face down cartel operatives. "You walk in behind me," Vincent instructed, his tone dead serious. "You do not speak unless spoken to. You are my lead appraiser. If Keller presses you, you blind him with science. You do not show fear." "I'm not afraid of an art appraiser," Faye said, picking up the heavy folder containing the drawing. "You should be," Vincent replied, turning toward the door. "Keller isn't just an appraiser. He's the cartel's executioner. If he thinks we are lying, no one walks out of that conference room." The secure conference room was located in the basement of the compound. It was a concrete bunker lined with acoustic panels and dominated by a massive stainless steel table. The air was frigid, pumped heavily with filtration units to eliminate any ambient dust or moisture. 3 men stood on the far side of the table. 2 were built like freight trains, wearing ill-fitting suits that barely concealed the bulk of shoulder holsters. The 3rd man was Keller. He was thin, completely bald, and wore a bespoke Navy suit that cost more than Faye's annual salary. He had the cold, dead eyes of a shark. Vincent walked into the room first. He didn't offer his hand. He didn't smile. He simply walked to the head of the steel table and stopped. Faye filed in behind him, clutching the portfolio to her chest. Thomas stood silently by the door. "Mr. Russo," Keller said. His accent was thick, precise, and devoid of warmth. "I apologize for the early arrival. My employer is anxious to conclude this transaction." "Punctuality is never an insult, Keller," Vincent replied smoothly. He gestured to the table. "My lead restorer has prepared the piece for your inspection." Faye stepped forward. She placed the portfolio on the steel table. Her hands didn't shake. The bruising on her left arm was hidden beneath a long-sleeved, dark silk blouse Thomas had procured for her, but it throbbed a steady, painful rhythm, keeping her grounded in reality. She opened the portfolio and carefully slid the Caravaggio sketch onto the table. Keller didn't say a word. He pulled a pair of white cotton inspection gloves from his pocket and slipped them on. From his leather briefcase, he produced a jeweler's loupe, a high-powered UV flashlight, and a digital micrometer. Silence descended on the room. It was thick, oppressive, and heavy with the threat of violence. The two cartel bodyguards watched Vincent. Vincent watched Keller. Faye watched the drawing. Keller leaned over the vellum. He clicked on the UV flashlight, sweeping the harsh violet beam over the paper. He was looking for modern optical brighteners, synthetic fibers that glowed under blacklight. The paper, authentically sourced from the 17th century, remained dull and lifeless. He turned off the flashlight and fitted the loupe to his right eye. He leaned in inches from the paper. Faye's heart hammered against her ribs. She kept her face completely blank. She mentally reviewed the chemical bonds she had just severed, the fibers she had burned. It was a perfect forgery, but perfection was subjective when viewed through the lens of a killer. Keller spent 4 agonizing minutes examining the cross-hatching. He moved slowly across the jawline, the exact spot Faye had doused in sulfuric acid less than 20 minutes ago. He straightened up. He removed the loupe. "The iron gall degradation is significant," Keller noted, his voice flat. He looked directly at Faye. "Almost too significant for a piece allegedly kept in a climate-controlled vault in Geneva for the last century. It was a trap." He was testing her provenance knowledge. Faye didn't flinch. She met his dead eyes with the practiced, arrogant boredom of a high-end art snob. "The piece hasn't been in Geneva for a century, Mr. Keller," Faye said, her voice dripping with academic condescension. "It was held in a private collection in Palermo until 1942. It was subjected to intense Mediterranean humidity and poor storage conditions in a basement during the Allied bombings. The degradation you are looking at is the result of fluctuating dew points reacting with the sulfur in the ink over an 80-year period before it was finally stabilized in the Swiss vault." She lied flawlessly. It was a story Preston had drafted weeks ago, but she delivered it with the conviction of absolute truth. Keller stared at her. He was searching for a micro-expression, a nervous twitch, a bead of sweat. Faye gave him nothing. She was a woman who had survived the chaotic, violent whims of the art underworld. A cartel accountant wasn't going to break her. Keller looked back down at the drawing. He traced a gloved finger lightly over the edge of the paper. "The paper checks out. The ink degradation matches the historical timeline," Keller finally said. He turned to Vincent. "The piece is authenticated." The collective drop in blood pressure in the room was almost audible. Keller reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a heavy, encrypted smartphone. He tapped a brief message and hit send. 10 seconds later, Vincent's own phone buzzed in his pocket. Vincent pulled it out, glanced at the screen, and nodded. $5 million had just cleared the offshore accounts. "A pleasure doing business, Mr. Russo," Keller said, carefully sliding the drawing back into the archival sleeve and placing it in his briefcase. "My employer will be very satisfied." "Safe travels back to Geneva, Keller," Vincent replied. The 3 men turned and walked out of the concrete bunker. Thomas followed them, securing the heavy door behind them. Faye stood frozen by the steel table. The adrenaline that had been keeping her upright suddenly evaporated, leaving behind a profound, hollow exhaustion. Her knees felt like water. She gripped the edge of the table to steady herself. Vincent turned to her. The cold, mechanical mob boss melted away, replaced by the man who had kissed her upstairs. He crossed the room in 2 strides, his hands coming down to grip her waist, steadying her. "You held your ground," Vincent said quietly, a fierce, undeniable pride burning in his dark eyes. "You looked the devil in the face, and you lied like a professional." "I lied to survive," Faye whispered, her head dropping forward to rest against his chest. She could hear his heart beating, steady and strong. "Is it over?" "The cartel is satisfied. Preston is gone. The gallery will be scrubbed and reopened under a new LLC by next month." Vincent let go of her waist and stepped back. He reached into his jacket pocket. He pulled out a thick, heavy manila envelope and placed it on the steel table between them. Faye looked at it. "What is that?" "Your exit," Vincent said. His voice was completely devoid of emotion, a forced, brutal neutrality. "There is a passport in there, a new social security number, the title to a house in a gated community in Monterey, California, and a bank card linked to an account with $2 million in clean, untraceable funds. A car is waiting upstairs to take you to a private airstrip." Faye stared at the envelope. It was everything she had ever dreamed of when she was scraping together rent money, eating ramen, and navigating the predatory politics of the art world. It was safety. It was peace. It was an absolute, ironclad guarantee that she would never be hurt again. She looked up at Vincent. He was standing perfectly still, his hands clasped behind his back. He was giving her a choice, but it was costing him everything to do it. The exhaustion in his face was profound. He looked like a man who had built a kingdom of violence and was finally realizing the absolute isolation of his throne. Faye slowly reached out and placed her hand on the manila envelope. The paper was rough under her fingertips. It represented a life of quiet anonymity. She would wake up, look at the ocean, perhaps open a small, legitimate restoration shop. She would be safe. She thought about the Hawthorne Charity Gala. She thought about the 100 safe people in tailored suits and silk gowns who had watched Preston Croft break her arm and had simply turned their heads. Safety was an illusion. The world was a fundamentally violent place, run by predators and cowards. The only difference between the elite society of the city and the brutalist concrete compound she was currently standing in was honesty. Vincent didn't hide his nature behind charity auctions and fake smiles. He was a monster, yes, but he was a monster who had leveled his world to protect hers. Faye slid the envelope across the stainless steel table, pushing it back toward Vincent. Vincent looked at the envelope, then slowly up at her face. His jaw tightened. "Faye, do not make a decision based on adrenaline. If you walk out that door, you are free. If you stay..." He trailed off, the gravity of the alternative hanging heavy in the freezing air of the bunker. "If I stay, I am a target," Faye finished for him, her voice steady, stripping away the fear that had defined her for 3 years. "I belong to you. I become part of this." "Yes." "Good." The single word echoed off the concrete walls. Faye walked around the steel table. She didn't shrink away from the harsh fluorescent lighting. She didn't cradle her bruised arm. She closed the distance between them, stepping directly into his space. "I have spent my entire life being terrified of men like Preston Croft," Faye said, looking up into Vincent's pitch-black eyes. "I have played by the rules of a society that doesn't care if I live or die. I am done playing the victim, Vincent. I don't want to disappear to California and pretend the dark doesn't exist." Vincent stared at her, the rigid control he maintained over his entire empire beginning to fracture. "You don't know what you are asking for." "I know exactly what I am asking for," Faye said. She reached up, placing her hand flat against his chest, right over his heart. "I am asking for the one man who looked at me in a room full of cowards and said, 'Get away from her.' I am choosing my monster. A ragged, heavy breath tore through Vincent's chest. The forced neutrality vanished. He reached out, his hands gripping her face, his thumbs tracing the line of her cheekbones. It wasn't a gentle touch. It was an absolute, undeniable claim. "If you stay," Vincent murmured, his face inches from hers, his voice thick with a dark, territorial possessiveness. "There is no going back. You are not a civilian anymore, Faye. You are mine. My life is your life. My enemies are your enemies." "I know," she whispered. "I will burn down half this city before I let anyone touch you again." "I know." He kissed her. This time there was no hesitation, no holding back. It was a kiss that sealed a pact. It was deep, consuming, and fiercely protective. Faye wrapped her arms around his neck, pulling him closer, anchoring herself in the storm of his reality. She tasted the absolute power of the man holding her, and for the first time in her life, she didn't feel afraid. She felt invincible. They finally broke apart, the silence of the bunker wrapping around them like a heavy blanket. Vincent kept one arm wrapped tightly around her waist, refusing to let her step back. He looked down at her, a profound shift settling over his features. The exhaustion was still there, but the isolation was gone. "Come," Vincent said softly. He led her out of the basement, up the stairs, and into the sprawling, brutalist living room on the main floor. The heavy bulletproof glass windows looked out over the vast expanse of the forested compound. The sun had finally broken through the gray, overcast sky, casting long, sharp shadows across the manicured lawn. The armed guard still walked the perimeter. The Belgian Malinois still paced the fence line. It was a fortress preparing for an endless war. Faye stood by the window, her bruised arm resting against the cool glass. Vincent stood directly behind her, his chest flush against her back, his arms wrapping around her waist. He rested his chin on the top of her head. "It's an ugly world out there," Vincent said, watching the tree line. "I know," Faye replied, leaning her weight back into his solid frame. She looked out over the compound, no longer seeing a prison, but a kingdom. "But it's our world now." Vincent's arms tightened around her. In the quiet solitude of the armored house, the Mafia boss finally stopped fighting the war alone. He had found his queen, forged in the fires of deception and survival, and heaven help anyone who ever tried to take her from him again. Faye made the ultimate choice. She didn't just survive the darkness, she claimed it as her own. By rejecting a safe, quiet life, she stepped out of the shadows of the art gallery and directly onto the throne beside Vincent Russo. Their enemies are watching, but this Mafia king and his new queen are ready for war. If you love this intense, grounded Mafia romance, smash that like button. Share this story with your friends who love dark, high-stakes drama, and subscribe with the bell turned on so you never miss an upload.